From an early age, I found comfort in the sound of engines and the rhythm of open roads. My teenage years were spent working at my uncle's repair shop, learning the satisfaction of fixing what was broken. After high school, trucking became my path, offering freedom and independence I craved. Meeting Maggie was like a spark in my life. We met in a roadside diner during a long layover. Her quick wit and infectious laugh pulled me in immediately. Within 6 months, we were married, planning a future built on trust and shared dreams. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. But we were happy. Life on the road had its challenges. Long hours away from home made me yearn for stability. Yet, every time I called home to hear the giggles of my daughters, Lily and Lucy, it reminded me why I worked so hard. Maggie had her complaints about my absences, but we managed. Or so I thought. The first cracks in our marriage were so small, they were almost invisible. Maggie began missing my calls more often. When we did talk, her voice seemed distant, distracted. I brushed it off as stress from managing the house and kids. After all, trust was the foundation of our relationship. Or so I believed. Looking back, I can see the signs were always there, but at the time, I couldn't, or maybe wouldn't, connect the dots. It started subtly, like an occasional coldness in Maggie's tone or her lack of enthusiasm when I called from the road. At first, I chalked it up to exhaustion. She was home all day managing the girls and the house. That kind of work takes a toll, and I told myself that her short temper or moments of aloofness were just part of the stress. But it didn't stop there. Her phone became an extension of her hand, something I'd never seen before. Maggie wasn't the type to obsess over social media or texts. We had often laughed about how little she used her phone, calling it her electronic paperweight. Suddenly, though, she seemed glued to it, smiling faintly at messages she didn't share or quickly turning the screen away when I entered the room. I didn't want to pry. I respected her privacy. But it gnawed at me. Then there were the late nights. At first, it was an occasional dinner with coworkers or a night out with friends from her book club. No big deal. I encouraged her to have time for herself while I was away. But the nights became more frequent, and her explanations became vaguer. Once, I asked if she had a good time, and she froze, stumbling over a simple yes before rushing to change the subject. My daughters, Lily and Lucy, didn't seem to notice anything amiss. They adored their mother and lit up whenever she was around. Yet, even their routines began to shift. Lucy, our youngest, let slip that Uncle James had come by to help fix the dishwasher while I was on the road. My stomach tightened. James was a name I knew, James Hastings, the boss's son. He'd worked at the shop for years, though our paths rarely crossed. He was brash, loud-mouthed, and had a reputation for stirring up trouble. Why he was fixing appliances in my house was a question I didn't ask at the time, but the thought lodged itself in my mind. One evening, while I was on a layover in Nebraska, I called home like usual. The girls answered, chattering excitedly about their day, but Maggie wasn't on the call. "Mommy's busy," Lily explained. Busy. It was past 8, the girls' bedtime. I asked what she was doing, and Lily hesitated before saying, "Talking to Uncle James. They're laughing a lot." I felt my grip on the phone tighten, but I kept my voice steady. "That's nice," I said, forcing a smile into my tone. When Maggie finally picked up the phone an hour later, her voice was warm and cheerful, like nothing was out of the ordinary. I asked if she'd been enjoying the girls' company that evening, and she responded with a quick, "Oh, of course." We played a little, and then I cleaned up the kitchen. She didn't mention James. The doubts started to weigh heavier after that. I found myself waking up in my truck sleeper cab at odd hours, replaying small moments in my mind. The way she rushed me off the phone, her sudden attachment to her phone, the fact that James seemed to have found his way into our family life. The next time I was home, I decided to surprise her with dinner. I made her favorite, spaghetti carbonara with extra parmesan. Maggie came home later than expected, claiming she'd been caught up at work. I believed her until I hugged her and caught the faintest whiff of cologne. It wasn't mine. She didn't notice my hesitation, or if she did, she didn't let on. I asked how her day was, and she gave me a vague rundown of tasks that didn't quite add up. "You seem distracted," I said, testing the waters. "I'm just tired," she replied, her smile thin and tired. I didn't press her. Instead, I started to watch more closely. I noticed how often she used excuses about errands or overtime to leave the house. There was an energy to her when she got ready, an excitement I hadn't seen in years. Once, I suggested we go out together while I was home, and she declined, saying she needed a quiet night to recharge. Later that evening, while I was folding laundry in the living room, she stepped out for a quick drive. She was gone 2 hours. I asked where she'd gone, and she dismissed it with a breezy, "I just needed some air." For the first time in our marriage, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Maggie still kissed me goodbye before I left for work, still told me she loved me before bed. But those moments felt mechanical, as if she were performing a role rather than living it. When I mentioned James casually one evening, asking if he'd been helping out around the house lately, her reaction was telling. She stiffened, then laughed nervously, brushing it off. "Oh no, that was just that one time. I haven't seen him since," she said, avoiding my eyes. I didn't believe her. The seeds of doubt had grown into something I couldn't ignore. Still, I told myself I could be wrong. I didn't want to be the paranoid husband who saw betrayal in every shadow. But deep down, I knew something was unraveling, and I was powerless to stop it. After 16 grueling days on the road, I finally completed my delivery ahead of schedule. Exhaustion hung over me like a cloud, but the thought of surprising Maggie and the girls brightened my spirits. It wasn't often I made it home early, and I was eager to spend a quiet evening with my family. As I turned onto our street, I noticed a truck in the driveway that didn't belong there. It was James Hastings, a vehicle I recognized from the shop. My heart thudded heavily in my chest. For a moment, I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe he was helping Maggie with another repair, or perhaps he was just visiting. But why would Maggie call him instead of me? I parked discreetly down the street and watched. The minutes ticked by, and nothing seemed out of place, until the front door opened. Maggie stepped out, dressed in a casual outfit that looked too polished for a day at home. Behind her, James followed, carrying his rig bag. My daughters trailed them, chattering and giggling. It wasn't just the sight of them together that made my stomach drop. It was the way they moved, the way James and Maggie stood too close, exchanged a glance that lingered too long. My daughters climbed into Maggie's car, and James bent down, ruffling Lucy's hair like he'd done it 100 times before. Then Maggie hugged him. It wasn't a casual, friendly hug. Her arms lingered around his neck, her head tilted just slightly as if they were sharing a private moment. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just some acquaintance or handyman passing through. James was a part of their lives, a part of my family. I reached for my phone and hit record, capturing the scene. The video was shaky, but it didn't matter. The truth was undeniable. They didn't notice me parked there, my newly restored truck blending into the neighborhood. As they drove off, Maggie heading toward the school, James following behind in his truck, I finally pulled into the driveway. My hands gripped the wheel tightly as I stared at the house that suddenly felt foreign to me. The house was quiet when I stepped inside, but it no longer felt like my home. Everything seemed too orderly, too perfect, as if it had been staged to hide something. The kids' rooms were untouched, the master bedroom neat and tidy. Nothing screamed affair at first glance, but my instincts told me to dig deeper. I checked Maggie's phone charger on the kitchen counter, but her phone wasn't there. It had gone with her. I opened drawers, flipped through papers, searched for anything out of place. At first, I found nothing. Then, I noticed a faint glow seeping from under the door to the unfinished third floor, a space we had never used. My pulse quickened as I climbed the stairs. The door creaked slightly as I opened it, revealing something I could hardly comprehend. The once empty attic had been transformed into a luxurious retreat. Sunlight poured through the windows, highlighting a king-sized bed draped in pristine white sheets. A sitting area with a flat-screen TV, a pair of plush armchairs, and a minibar sat neatly arranged. The closet door was ajar, revealing rows of neatly hung clothes, some Maggie's, but others clearly belonging to a man. On the coffee table, I saw a stack of DVDs and a bottle of wine, its cork half pressed back into the neck. A handmade card rested nearby, scrawled in crayon, "We love you, Uncle James." My legs felt weak as I took it all in. The DVDs weren't just movies, they were explicit. Maggie had always dismissed such things as disgusting, yet here they were. One was still in the DVD player. Hesitantly, I pressed play, and what appeared on the screen left me breathless. It was Maggie, doing things she had always refused to do with me. The version of her on the screen was unrecognizable, eager, uninhibited, a stranger. I couldn't watch more than a few seconds before I shut it off, bile rising in my throat. The realization hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just an affair, it was an entire life she had been living behind my back. As I turned to leave, I noticed a drawer slightly ajar near the bed. Inside, I found lingerie I'd never seen before and a small envelope containing a hotel keycard. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating, as if it carried the weight of every lie Maggie had told me. I stood there, staring at the evidence, feeling a mix of rage, humiliation, and heartbreak. My hands trembled as I gathered the card, the DVDs, and the crayon-scribbled note. The image of my daughters signing that card for James made my chest ache. By the time I left the attic, I knew nothing about my life would ever be the same. The hours after my discovery passed in a haze of disbelief and cold determination. I didn't know what I would do with the evidence I had found, but I knew I couldn't let it sit in that attic. I packed the DVDs, the card, and the hotel keycard into a shoebox and stashed it under the passenger seat of my truck. For now, it was all I had, the undeniable proof of what Maggie had done. When Maggie returned later that afternoon, she acted as though nothing had happened. She walked in with a bright smile, chatting with the girls about their day at school. I stayed in the kitchen, my back to the door, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. "Hey, you're home early," she called, her voice light and cheerful. I forced a small smile and turned to face her. "Yeah, finished my route ahead of schedule." My tone sounded flat, even to me, but she didn't seem to notice. She kissed me on the cheek, a routine gesture that felt hollow now. "That's great. We should celebrate tonight. I can whip up something nice for dinner." Her ease, her normalcy, made my stomach churn. Was this how she acted every day? Smiling and pretending while I was out there, working to provide for a family she was quietly dismantling? I nodded mutely, unable to meet her eyes. As the evening wore on, I watched her closely, searching for cracks in her facade. She was attentive with the girls, laughing at their stories and helping them with their homework. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed everything was fine. But then, small things began to stand out. Her phone buzzed more than usual, and though she glanced at it discreetly, I caught her smiling once or twice at messages she didn't share. When I offered to take her phone to charge it for her, she waved me off quickly, saying she'd take care of it. That night, after she went to bed, I waited until I was sure she was asleep before slipping out of the room. Her purse was on the counter, her phone inside. Carefully, I unlocked it. It wasn't hard. I knew the passcode. The messages confirmed what I already knew but deepened the betrayal. James' name appeared frequently, though saved under a different contact name, Joanne B. As if the man hadn't already taken enough from me, he had to hide behind the name of one of Maggie's real friends. The messages were damning. They were careful not to be explicit, but their familiarity spoke volumes. Phrases like, "can't wait to see you again," and "last night was incredible," made my chest tighten. I scrolled further, finding plans to meet up at a hotel, likely where the keycard had come from, and even casual mentions of spending time with the girls. At some point, I couldn't read anymore. The bile in my throat threatened to overwhelm me, and I slammed the phone down on the counter. Maggie stirred upstairs, and I froze, waiting until her breathing steadied again before retreating to the couch. Sleep was impossible. My mind raced with questions, anger, and a deep, gnawing sense of loss. How long had this been going on? How much of my life with her was real, and how much was a lie? Most of all, what kind of man allowed another to step into his family's life like this? The next morning, I confronted her indirectly. As she packed lunches for the girls, I asked, "How's Joanne been doing? Haven't heard her name in a while." She froze for a split second before forcing a smile. "Oh, she's fine. Just busy, you know." The lie came so easily, it chilled me. The day passed in tense silence, each of us pretending things were normal. Maggie carried on as though her world wasn't about to come crashing down, and I stewed in a mix of fury and heartbreak. By evening, I decided I couldn't keep playing along. When the girls were asleep, I asked Maggie to join me in the living room. She looked wary but followed, sitting across from me with her arms crossed. "You've been distant lately," I began, keeping my voice steady. "Is there something you want to tell me?" Her brow furrowed, and she shook her head. No. I don't know what you're talking about. I held her gaze, searching for a shred of remorse or guilt. I feel like there's something you're not telling me. Something about James. Her expression didn't falter. James. What about him? Her ability to lie so smoothly made my blood boil. You tell me, I said evenly. You seem to be spending a lot of time with him. Maggie sighed, as if I were the unreasonable one. He's just been helping out a little while you're gone. You're away so much, and things come up. That's all. I wanted to scream at her, to throw the evidence I had gathered in her face and demand answers. But I held back. Instead, I nodded slowly. Is that really all it is? Her eyes met mine, and for a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of fear. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a calm smile. Of course. You're overthinking it. Overthinking it. The words hit me like a slap. She wasn't just betraying me, she was insulting my intelligence. I let the conversation end there, but my decision was made. The next step would be hers, whether she realized it or not. I would wait, watch, and prepare for whatever came next. I didn't have to wait long for Maggie's lies to unravel further. The following morning, she left the house earlier than usual, claiming she had errands to run before work. My gut told me to follow her, even if it made me feel like a man I never wanted to become. I trailed her car at a distance, keeping my newly restored truck inconspicuous. She drove to a hotel on the edge of town, a modest place that wouldn't attract attention. My stomach twisted as I parked across the street and watched her walk inside, her demeanor casual, almost carefree. An hour later, James arrived. His truck pulled into the lot with the same ease, like this was routine for them. He didn't even bother to look around before heading inside. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My chest felt heavy, like a weight I couldn't shake was pressing down on me. I wanted to storm in, confront them, demand answers. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear of the scene I might cause or the damage it would do to my daughters if things escalated. Instead, I waited. 2 hours later, they emerged together, laughing as if they didn't have a care in the world. James opened the door to his truck for her like a gentleman, and Maggie climbed in without hesitation. I followed them as they drove toward the outskirts of town, eventually stopping at a park. They sat together on a bench, talking and occasionally laughing. Maggie's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. It was like watching a stranger, a woman I didn't recognize. By the time I returned home, my mind was made up. I couldn't let this fester any longer. That evening, when Maggie returned, I was waiting for her in the living room. She looked surprised to see me there, her purse slung over one shoulder and her expression guarded. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice light but strained. "Sit down," I said, keeping my tone steady. Her smile faltered, and she hesitated before setting her purse down and taking a seat across from me. "What's this about?" I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "I know, Maggie. About you and James." The color drained from her face. "What are you talking about?" she stammered. "I followed you today," I said, my voice growing colder. "To the hotel. To the park. I saw everything." Her eyes darted to the side, searching for an escape route. "You're being ridiculous," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what you think you saw, but you're wrong." "Don't insult me," I snapped, my patience unraveling. "I've seen the messages, Maggie. I've seen the DVDs in the attic. I've seen the card our daughters made for him. Do you really think I'm that stupid?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she stood abruptly, pacing the room. "It's not what you think," she finally said, her voice defensive. "James is just a friend. He's been helping me out while you're gone. That's all." "A friend," I repeated, my tone dripping with disbelief. "Do friends meet at hotels? Do friends have their clothes hanging in a hidden room in the attic? Do friends laugh while they tear apart a family?" Her defenses crumbled, and her voice turned angry. "Maybe if you were home more, I wouldn't need help," she shot back. "You're always on the road, always gone. Do you know how hard it is to hold everything together by myself? So this is my fault? I asked, standing now. You're blaming me for working to provide for this family? I'm not blaming you, she said, her voice quieter now, though still sharp. I'm just saying, things haven't been right between us for a long time. You know that. Her words hit like a punch to the gut. So your solution was to bring another man into our home? To let him get close to our kids? To lie to me over and over again? Tears welled in her eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were from guilt, frustration, or simply the fact that she'd been caught. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said softly. Didn't mean for it to happen? I repeated, my voice rising. You didn't just trip and fall into an affair, Maggie. This took effort. Planning. You made a choice. Every single time. She stayed silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. I want the truth, I said after a long pause. All of it. No more lies. No more excuses. If there's even a shred of hope for us, you owe me that much. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. I don't know where to start. Start with how long it's been going on, I said coldly. Her hesitation told me everything I needed to know. A year, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. A year. 12 months of betrayal, lies, and deceit. I turned away from her, unable to look at her any longer. You've been doing this while I've been out there, working my ass off for this family. For you. I'm sorry, she said, but the words felt hollow. Sorry doesn't fix this, I said, my voice cracking under the weight of my emotions. Sorry doesn't erase what you've done. It doesn't make it okay. She didn't respond, and for the first time, the weight of what had happened seemed to settle over both of us. The room fell into a heavy silence, the kind that comes when there's nothing left to say. That night, I barely slept. The sound of Maggie's soft sobs from the other room filtered through the house, but I felt no comfort in her tears. If anything, they deepened the chasm between us. What hurt more than her betrayal was the realization that James wasn't just some faceless interloper. He was embedded in our lives, our home, our routines, and worst of all, our children's hearts. The next morning, I tried to keep things normal for the girls' sake. Pancakes for breakfast, their favorite. Lily chattered about an upcoming art project at school, while Lucy asked if I could help fix her bike's training wheels that weekend. Maggie sat silently at the table, poking at her food, her eyes puffy from a night of crying. As I cleared the plates, Lucy's innocent voice cut through the tense silence. Daddy, is Uncle James coming over today? The plate in my hand slipped, clattering into the sink. Why would you ask that, sweetheart? I said, keeping my tone calm. Because Mommy said he might come by to help fix the dishwasher, she said, her wide eyes glancing between Maggie and me. I turned to Maggie, who wouldn't meet my gaze. Uncle James is very busy, she said quickly, forcing a smile. I don't think he'll be stopping by. Lucy's shoulders slumped. But he promised to show me how to fix things like you do, Daddy. My chest tightened. James had inserted himself into my role, not just as Maggie's partner but as my daughter's father figure when I wasn't around. Lucy, you don't need Uncle James to show you how to fix things. That's my job, I said firmly, but with a smile to soften the edge. Lily chimed in, her voice hesitant. He's nice, Daddy. He always tells us funny stories. And he helped me with my homework once. You were working. I nodded, trying to hide how deeply their words cut. I'm glad you like him, I said, though the words tasted bitter. But I'm here now, and I'll help with whatever you need. The girls beamed, but Maggie stood abruptly, muttering something about needing to get ready for work. She left the room quickly, her retreat almost cowardly. After dropping the girls at school, I sat in the parking lot for a long time, staring at the dashboard. James wasn't just a mistake Maggie had made in a moment of weakness. He had become a fixture in their lives, someone my daughters trusted and admired. The betrayal wasn't limited to my marriage. It had seeped into the bond one had with my kids. That evening, I decided to confront Maggie about James' relationship with the girls. She came home late, as usual, her excuses ringing hollow. Once the girls were in bed, I cornered her in the kitchen. Did you think about how this would affect Lily and Lucy? I asked, my voice low but firm. Her eyes widened. What do you mean? I mean letting James become a part of their lives. Letting them see him as someone they can rely on while I'm gone, I said, the frustration bubbling to the surface. They adore him, Maggie. They don't see him as your affair partner. They see him as family. She looked down, guilt written all over her face. I didn't plan for it to be like this. Didn't plan for it? I repeated, incredulous. You let him into our home, Maggie. You let him play with our kids, help them with homework, promise them things. You didn't think about what would happen when this all came out. Her voice cracked as she replied, I never wanted to hurt them. Well, you did, I snapped, unable to hold back the anger anymore. And you hurt me. They trust him, Maggie. And when they find out the truth, it's going to break their hearts. She started crying again, but this time, I didn't comfort her. I couldn't. I left her in the kitchen and went to sit in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. My mind replayed Lucy's words over and over. He promised to show me how to fix things like you do, Daddy. The next few days were tense. Maggie avoided me as much as she could, and I poured all my energy into being there for the girls. I took them to the park, helped them with their homework, and even let them pick out a movie for a Friday night marathon. But the shadow of James lingered. During dinner one evening, Lucy mentioned that Uncle James had taken them to get ice cream a few weeks ago. Lily added that he'd even come to one of their school plays when I couldn't make it. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. That's nice, I said, though every word felt like swallowing glass. Later that night, I looked through the shoebox of evidence again. The card from the girls, signed with love for James, stared back at me. My chest ached as I realized how deeply intertwined he was in their lives. Confronting Maggie was one thing, but untangling this mess from my daughter's hearts was something I didn't know how to handle. This wasn't just my battle anymore. It was my family's. By the time the weekend rolled around, I knew I couldn't carry this weight alone anymore. My mind was a storm of emotions, anger, heartbreak, betrayal, but my daughters were still my priority. I needed clarity, advice, and support from someone who understood the gravity of the situation. I decided to confide in my best friend, Mark, a man I'd trusted since we were kids. Mark was one of those people who always gave it to you straight, even if it wasn't what you wanted to hear. That's exactly what I needed. We met at a diner on the edge of town, our usual spot for catching up. Mark greeted me with his usual grin, but it faded quickly as he took in my expression. What's going on? He asked, sliding into the booth across from me. For a moment, I hesitated. Saying it out loud felt like making it even more real, but I had to let it out. It's Maggie, I began, my voice low. She's been seeing someone else. For a year. Mark's face hardened. You're kidding. I shook my head, swallowing the lump in my throat. It's worse than that. It's James Hastings. His eyes widened in shock. The boss's kid? The loudmouth? Are you serious? I nodded, the shame bubbling up as I explained everything. The messages, the DVDs, the hotel meetings, and worst of all, how James had become a fixture in my daughter's lives. Mark listened intently, his fists clenching on the table as I spoke. That's low, he said finally. I mean, I knew James was a piece of work, but this? Sneaking into your family like that. And Maggie, I don't even know what to say about her. Neither do I admitted. It's like she's a different person. And the girls, they adore him, Mark. They don't understand what's really going on. Mark leaned back, his expression thoughtful. What are you going to do? I don't know, I said honestly. I've thought about divorce, but the girls, I don't want to tear their lives apart. He nodded slowly. I get it. But, man, staying in this situation isn't good for them either. Kids pick up on more than we realize. They'll sense the tension between you and Maggie. I rubbed my temples, the weight of his words sinking in. He was right. Lily and Lucy were sharp. They'd already noticed the distance between me and Maggie. It was only a matter of time before they started asking questions. Maybe you should talk to a lawyer, Mark suggested. Figure out what your options are. Even if you don't go through with it right away, it's better to be prepared. The thought of involving lawyers made my stomach churn, but I knew he was right. I couldn't face this alone. I needed a plan, not just for my sake but for my daughters as well. After we left the diner, I sat in my truck for a long time, staring at my phone. My instinct was to call my father, Arthur. He'd always been a source of wisdom in my life, though our relationship had its ups and downs. If anyone could guide me through this mess, it was him. When he picked up, his voice was warm, as always. "Hey, son. Everything okay?" "Not really," I admitted. "I need to talk to you about something big." I heard the concern in his tone as he said, "What's going on?" So I told him. All of it. The affair, the deception, the impact on the girls. By the time I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, son," Arthur said finally, his voice heavy with sadness. "I can't imagine how hard this must be for you." "I don't know what to do, Dad," I said, my voice cracking. "I feel like I'm losing everything. My marriage, my family, my role as a father." "You're not losing your family," he said firmly. "You're still their father, and nothing changes that. But you need to decide what's best for you and the girls. Staying in a toxic situation isn't the answer." His words echoed Mark's, and I realized the truth in them. As much as I wanted to protect my daughters from the fallout, staying in this broken marriage would only make things worse in the long run. "Talk to a lawyer," Arthur advised. "Find out what you can do to make this transition as smooth as possible for the girls. And don't be afraid to lean on us. Your mother and I are here for you." After the call, I felt a small measure of relief. I wasn't alone in this. I had people who cared about me and my daughters, who would help me navigate the storm ahead. That evening, I made an appointment with a local family lawyer. It felt like a betrayal of the life I'd built with Maggie, but I knew it was necessary. If I was going to fight for my daughter's stability and happiness, I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. The days leading up to my meeting with the lawyer were heavy with silence. Maggie and I had fallen into a strained rhythm of avoidance. We barely spoke, except for necessities involving the girls. Even Lily and Lucy began to notice the tension, their usual giggles and chatter around the dinner table replaced by hesitant glances and whispered questions. "Is everything okay, Daddy?" Lily asked one evening as I tucked her into bed. I forced a smile and stroked her hair. "Of course, sweetheart. You and Lucy are my #1 priority. Never forget that." She nodded, but her small hand lingered on mine. "I don't like it when you and Mommy don't talk much," she whispered. Her words cut deeper than anything Maggie had said or done. I kissed her forehead and promised to make everything better, even though I had no idea how. The day of my lawyer's appointment arrived quickly. Walking into the office felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. The lawyer, a calm woman named Sarah who exuded professionalism, listened carefully as I explained the situation. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "This is a difficult situation, but it's not uncommon," she said gently. "Your primary concern is your daughters, and that's the right focus. Custody arrangements can be tailored to ensure their lives are as stable as possible." Her words provided some relief, but they also confirmed what I'd feared. A divorce was likely inevitable. Sarah walked me through the process, splitting assets, custody agreements, and even how to approach conversations with the girls. It was overwhelming, but it gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in weeks. That evening, I sat alone in the living room, replaying the lawyer's advice in my mind. Maggie eventually came downstairs, her expression wary. "We need to talk," I said, breaking the silence. She hesitated but nodded, sitting on the edge of the couch as far from me as possible. "I spoke to a lawyer," I began, watching her face closely. Her eyes widened, but she said nothing. "This can't keep going on, Maggie," I continued. "What you've done, it's destroyed the trust between us. I don't see a way to fix this." She looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. "I never wanted it to get this far," she murmured. "Then why did you let it?" I asked, my voice firm but calm. "Why didn't you stop before it reached this point?" Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment, she looked like a shadow of the woman I'd married. "I don't know," she said finally. "I was lonely. You were gone so much, and I felt like we were growing apart." Her words ignited a fresh wave of anger. "So instead of talking to me, instead of working on our marriage, you turned to him?" She didn't respond, and the silence between us grew heavier. "This isn't just about us," I said after a moment. "It's about Lily and Lucy. They adore you, Maggie. They trust you. How do you think they'll feel when they find out what's happened?" Tears filled her eyes. I never wanted to hurt them, she whispered. But you did, I said bluntly. You brought James into their lives, into our home, and now they're going to lose him too. She started crying then, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to shake her whole body. I watched, torn between anger and pity, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. When her tears finally subsided, she looked at me, her face streaked with guilt. What happens now? I don't know yet, I admitted. But things can't go back to the way they were. I won't let the girls grow up in a home filled with lies and resentment. Maggie nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the floor. For the first time, it seemed like she truly understood the gravity of what she'd done. Over the next few days, I began taking steps toward separation. I started documenting everything. Messages, schedules, even the girls' interactions with Maggie and James. It felt cold and calculated, but I knew it was necessary. If it came down to a custody battle, I needed to be prepared. Maggie tried to make amends in small ways, offering to cook dinner, asking if I needed help with the girls' school projects, but it felt hollow. Her actions couldn't erase the betrayal or the damage it had done. One evening, Lucy brought me a drawing she'd made. A picture of our family, with me, Maggie, the girls, and James all holding hands. She beamed with pride as she showed it to me, but my heart broke at the sight. It's beautiful, Lucy, I said, forcing a smile. You're such a talented artist. She hugged me tightly before running off to show Maggie, leaving me staring at the drawing with a heavy heart. The fallout of Maggie's actions wasn't just affecting me, it was affecting our daughters in ways they couldn't yet understand. And as much as I wanted to shield them from the truth, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came to light. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself grappling with the most difficult decision of my life. Every step I took seemed weighted with consequences, not just for me but for Maggie, and most importantly, for Lily and Lucy. I had to choose between staying in this broken marriage for the sake of the girls' stability or walking away to rebuild something better for myself and, eventually, for them. The tension in the house was unbearable. Maggie and I continued to live under the same roof, but we barely exchanged words. Her efforts to bridge the gap felt forced, like someone trying to plaster over a crack in a dam. The girls, perceptive as ever, picked up on the strain, their usual brightness dimmed by the silent war raging between us. One evening, after I tucked the girls into bed, I sat in the living room with a notebook, listing out the pros and cons of every option. Every time I looked at the list, the words blurred together. There were no easy answers. Staying meant sacrificing my self-respect and living a half-life, pretending things were normal. Leaving meant uprooting everything the girls knew, possibly damaging their sense of security. The following day, I decided to consult a counselor who specialized in family dynamics during separation. It wasn't easy admitting to a stranger that my marriage was crumbling, but I needed an outside perspective. Your daughter's well-being is your priority, the counselor said, her voice calm but firm. But remember, children are incredibly resilient. What they need most is love, consistency, and honesty. Staying in an unhappy marriage for their sake might shield them from short-term pain, but it can also expose them to long-term emotional strain. Her words stuck with me as I drove home. For so long, I'd clung to the idea that keeping the family together was the best option. But maybe that wasn't true. Maybe the best thing I could do for Lily and Lucy was to show them what it meant to value yourself, to stand up for your happiness, even in the face of heartbreak. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about the example I wanted to set for my daughters. Did I want them to grow up thinking it was okay to accept betrayal, to stay in situations that eroded their self-worth? Or did I want them to see that it was possible to rebuild, to create a life where trust and respect weren't negotiable? The next morning, I knew what I had to do. I sat Maggie down at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared so many meals, so many plans for the future. She looked at me with a mixture of apprehension and resignation, as if she already knew what I was going to say. I've made a decision, I said, my voice steady. I can't do this anymore, Maggie. For my sake and for the girls, we need to separate. Her face crumpled, and she began to cry, but I didn't falter. I've spoken to a lawyer, I continued. We need to figure out custody arrangements and how to make this transition as smooth as possible for Lily and Lucy. Through her tears, she nodded. I understand, she whispered.
I just...
I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't change what happened, I said gently but firmly. The damage is done. Now we need to focus on what's best for the girls. Over the next week, we began the painstaking process of unraveling our lives. I moved some of my belongings into the guest room, making it clear to the girls that this was a temporary arrangement. Maggie and I agreed to sit down with them together to explain what was happening, but I dreaded the conversation more than anything else. When the time came, we gathered the girls in the living room. Lucy sat on my lap, while Lily leaned against Maggie. I could see the confusion in their eyes, the way they clung to us as if sensing something was wrong. Mommy and Daddy have something important to talk to you about, I began, my voice trembling slightly. We've decided that we're going to live in different houses for a while. Lucy's brow furrowed. Why? She asked, her voice small. Maggie and I exchanged a glance before she spoke. Sometimes, grown-ups need space to figure things out. But no matter what happens, we both love you very much, and that will never change. Lily's eyes filled with tears, and she buried her face in Maggie's shoulder. Lucy looked up at me, her lip trembling. Are you mad at Mommy? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I took a deep breath and forced a smile. No, sweetie. Mommy and I just need to live apart for now, but we're still a team when it comes to taking care of you and Lily. The conversation was hard, and their tears were harder, but I felt a strange sense of relief afterward. The truth was out, and we could finally begin to move forward. That night, as I sat in the quiet of my truck, I felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to face it. For myself, and for my daughters. The weeks following our conversation with Lily and Lucy were some of the hardest of my life. Moving out of the house was like leaving behind a piece of myself. Every room was filled with memories, the good ones and the painful ones, that clung to me like shadows. But as much as it hurt, I knew I was doing the right thing. I found a small 2-bedroom rental not far from the girls' school. It wasn't much, but it was cozy, and I made it a priority to create a space where Lily and Lucy would feel at home. Their room was the first thing I set up, with bunk beds, soft blankets, and all their favorite toys. I even hung up some of Lucy's artwork on the walls to make it feel familiar. The first weekend they stayed with me, I felt both elated and heartbroken. Lucy helped me bake cookies in the tiny kitchen, her laughter filling the space, while Lily sat at the table, working on a school project. It felt almost normal, except for the moments when Lucy would ask, "When are we going back to Mommy's house?" Or when Lily would stare out the window, lost in thought. Maggie and I managed to maintain a civil co-parenting arrangement, though our interactions were strained. She seemed to be making an effort with the girls, attending school events, helping with homework, and making sure they felt loved. But I couldn't help noticing how tired she looked, as if the weight of her decisions was finally catching up to her. James, thankfully, had faded from the picture. Maggie assured me that their relationship was over, though I didn't ask for details. It didn't matter anymore. The damage was done, and I had no interest in rehashing the past. The girls adjusted better than I expected, though it wasn't without challenges. One evening, as I tucked Lily into bed, she asked, "Are you and Mommy ever going to live together again?" I hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said honestly. "But no matter what, we're always going to be a family. That will never change." She nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. "I miss it when we were all together," she whispered. "I do too," I admitted, stroking her hair. "But sometimes, grown-ups have to make hard decisions to make things better in the long run. You and Lucy are the most important things in the world to me. Don't ever forget that." She hugged me tightly, and for a moment, I felt like I was doing something right. Over time, I began to find my footing again. The routine of work and parenting gave me a sense of purpose, and I leaned on friends and family for support. Mark checked in regularly, dragging me out for coffee or beers when I needed a distraction. My parents, true to their word, were a constant source of encouragement, reminding me that I wasn't alone in this. One afternoon, while the girls were at school, I found myself sitting in the park, watching families play together. It hit me then how much had changed, and how much I had changed. The man I was a year ago, blindly trusting and eager to please, was gone. In his place was someone who had been broken but was learning to rebuild. When Maggie and I finalized the divorce, it was bittersweet. There was no shouting, no dramatic courtroom battles, just a quiet acknowledgement that our marriage had run its course. She apologized again, this time with a sincerity that seemed genuine. I accepted, though I knew forgiveness would take time. Life didn't magically become easier after the papers were signed, but it did become clearer. My focus shifted entirely to the girls and to building a future where they could thrive. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Lucy leaned against me, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "I like it here, Daddy," she said softly. "Me too," Lily added, glancing up from her coloring book. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the life I had imagined, but it was a life worth fighting for. In the quiet moments, when the girls were asleep and the house was still, I thought about what lay ahead. I didn't know if I'd ever trust someone the way I had trusted Maggie. I didn't know if I'd ever find love again. But what I did know was this: I had survived. The betrayal that once felt insurmountable had become a chapter in my story, not the ending. And as I looked at the faces of my daughters, I realized that I wasn't just rebuilding for me. I was rebuilding for them, too. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to take it. One step at a time.